Hey, have you ever wondered what it feels like when people stand up and change the world?
You mean like a big fight for freedom? Oh, I know one of the best stories about that. The French Revolution.
Exactly. Imagine this. It's the late 1700s in France. People are hungry, tired, and angry. Bread is so expensive they can barely eat. But the king and queen? They're living in a palace, eating fancy food every day.
Wow, that sounds unfair. No wonder people got angry. Didn't they tear down the Bastille?
Yes, that was just the start. Over the next few years, everything changed. Kings, queens, and castles couldn't stop the people. They wanted freedom, equality, and their rights.
This sounds like a wild story. And I'm guessing it didn't happen all at once.
Not at all. It was messy, bloody, and full of surprises. Stay with us, and we'll tell you how it all went down and how it shaped the world we live in today.
Let's go back to France in the 1700s. Life wasn't easy for most people. The country had three main groups, or estates. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobles, and the third estate was, well, almost everyone else. Farmers, workers, and even the growing middle class, called the bourgeoisie.
So the first two estates were the rich and powerful, and the third estate was the ones doing all the hard work, right?
Exactly. But here's the thing. The rich didn't pay many taxes, even though they had most of the money. The third estate? They paid almost all the taxes, and many of them didn't have enough to live on.
That sounds like a terrible system. No wonder people were unhappy. But what about the middle class you mentioned? The bourgeoisie?
They were an interesting group. Many were merchants, lawyers, or teachers. They had money, but they weren't allowed to hold big government jobs or have much power. They felt stuck, smart, and successful, but still treated as less important than the nobles.
I can see why they would want change. But wasn't the economy also in big trouble?
Yes, it was. France had spent a lot of money helping the American Revolution. That left the country in debt. And if that wasn't bad enough, bad weather ruined the crops in 1788. People couldn't afford bread, the main food for most families.
So people were taxed too much, food was too expensive, and the middle class wanted more respect. Sounds like a perfect storm for a revolution.
Exactly. And let's not forget one more thing. Ideas. The Enlightenment brought new ways of thinking. Writers like Rousseau and Voltaire said things like, all men are equal, and kings shouldn't have all the power.
Those ideas must have given people hope. They probably thought, why can't we change things too?
Exactly. The people were ready for something big. They just needed a spark to set it all off. And that's where things get really exciting.
By 1789, things were at a breaking point in France. The king, Louis XVI, needed money. The country was in debt, and people were starving. He decided to call the Estates General, a big meeting of representatives from the three estates.
Wait, had they done that before?
Not for a long time. The Estates General hadn't met since 1614. It was a big deal. The king hoped they would help him fix the financial crisis, but instead, it led to something very different.
What happened?
Well, the third estate, remember, that's the common people, wanted more power. They asked for a fair vote, but the nobles and clergy didn't want that. The third estate decided they'd had enough.
So they stood up for themselves?
They did. On June 17, 1789, they declared themselves the National Assembly. They said they were the true voice of the people. A few days later, when they were locked out of their usual meeting place, they gathered in an indoor tennis court.
The tennis court oath, right?
That's the one. They promised not to leave until they created a new constitution for France. This was huge. They were saying the king's power wasn't absolute anymore.
I bet the king wasn't happy about that.
Oh, he wasn't. At first, he tried to look like he was okay with it, but secretly, he started bringing soldiers into Paris. People thought he was planning to shut down the National Assembly by force.
That must have made everyone even angrier.
Exactly. On July 14, 1789, the anger boiled over. A huge crowd stormed the Bastille, a prison that was also a symbol of the king's power.
Why the Bastille?
For one, it had weapons. But more than that, it stood for everything people hated about the monarchy. By taking it down, they were saying, "We've had enough."
That's powerful. So the Bastille fell, and the revolution truly began.
Yes, and from that moment there was no turning back. The people of France were ready to fight for their freedom.
After the storming of the Bastille, the revolution gained momentum. The people were full of energy, and the National Assembly started making big changes.
What kind of changes?
For one, they wanted to get rid of the old feudal system. On August 4th, 1789, they abolished feudal privileges. This meant no more special rights for the nobles. Taxes had to be fair, and peasants didn't have to work for free on their lord's land anymore.
That must have been a huge relief for the peasants.
It was, and just a few weeks later, the Assembly passed something even bigger, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen.
That sounds important. What did it say?
It said all men are born free and equal. Everyone had the right to liberty, property, and safety. It was like a message to the whole world. France was changing, and no one could stop it.
But what about the king? Wasn't he still in power?
Yes, but his power was shrinking fast. Louis XVI didn't really like the changes, and he refused to approve some of them. That made people angry. Then, in October 1789, things got even worse.
What happened?
Food was still too expensive, and women in Paris were furious. Thousands of them marched to Versailles, where the king and queen were living. They demanded bread and action.
Wait, they walked all the way to Versailles?
They did. It's about 20 kilometers. When they got there, they broke into the palace and forced the king to move back to Paris.
That's incredible. So the king was now living in Paris, closer to the people?
Yes, but it wasn't really by choice. The National Assembly also moved to Paris and kept working on the new constitution. Meanwhile, the people started feeling like they had more of a voice.
How?
There were public meetings, clubs, and newspapers everywhere. People talked about politics, debated ideas, and even planted trees of liberty to celebrate the revolution. It was a whole new culture.
So things were changing fast, but I bet not everyone liked these changes.
You're right. The king was still trying to hold on to power, and many nobles wanted things to go back to the old ways. The tension was building, and soon it would reach a breaking point.
By 1791, the revolution had changed so much, but the country was far from calm. The National Assembly finished writing a new constitution. It gave the king limited powers, turning France into a constitutional monarchy.
So, the king still had a role, but he wasn't in charge anymore?
That's right. But Louis XVI wasn't happy about it. In fact, he and Queen Marie Antoinette secretly wanted to escape. They believed they could gather support outside of France and come back with an army to restore their full power.
Did they manage to get away?
Not really. In June 1791, the royal family tried to flee to Austria, where Marie Antoinette's family ruled, but they were caught in a small town called Varennes and brought back to Paris.
That must have been a disaster for the king's reputation.
It was. Many people felt betrayed. They started to think the king couldn't be trusted at all, and as the year went on, the divisions in the country grew even deeper.
What kind of divisions?
There were two main political groups in the National Assembly, the Girondins and the Montagnards. The Girondins wanted slow and steady change. They also believed the revolution should stay within France.
And the Montagnards?
They were more radical. They thought the revolution needed to go further, giving more power to the working class. They also believed France should spread revolutionary ideas across Europe.
That sounds like trouble waiting to happen.
Oh, it was. To make things worse, France went to war with Austria in April 1792. Prussia joined Austria, and the French army struggled at first. Many people blamed the king and queen, accusing them of secretly helping the enemy.
That must have made people even angrier.
It did. In August 1792, Paris erupted. Revolutionaries stormed the Tuileries Palace where the royal family lived. They arrested the king and queen and put them in prison.
So this was the end of the monarchy?
Not officially yet, but it was clear the monarchy was in serious danger. The National Assembly decided to form a new government called the National Convention. On September 21, 1792, they declared France a republic. The monarchy was over.
That's such a big change. But I can imagine things didn't settle down right away.
You're right. The revolution was about to enter its most dangerous and violent phase.
By 1793, France was a republic, but it was far from peaceful. The king and queen were in prison, and many people were calling for them to face trial.
Did they?
Yes. Louis XVI was found guilty of treason and executed in January 1793. 9 months later, Marie Antoinette was also sent to the guillotine. Their deaths shocked Europe and divided people in France even more.
So, was everyone in France in favor of the revolution?
Not at all. Some people still supported the monarchy, while others thought the revolution had gone too far. At the same time, France was fighting wars against Austria, Prussia, and other countries. The leaders of the revolution felt surrounded by enemies.
What did they do about it?
They created the Committee of Public Safety, which had almost total power. Its goal was to protect the revolution, but it did so in harsh ways. This period became known as the Reign of Terror.
Why was it called that?
Because thousands of people were arrested and executed. Anyone who was suspected of being against the revolution could be sent to the guillotine. This included nobles, priests, and even some revolutionaries who were seen as not radical enough.
That sounds terrifying. Who was in charge during this time?
The most famous leader was Maximilien Robespierre. He believed the terror was necessary to protect the revolution. He said, "Without terror, there can be no virtue."
But wasn't Robespierre eventually overthrown too?
He was. By 1794, even his allies started to think he had too much power. They arrested him, and he was executed, ending the Reign of Terror.
So what happened after the terror ended?
Things calmed down a bit, but France was still in chaos. The wars continued, and the country needed a strong leader. That's when a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte started to rise.
So the revolution didn't really end, it just moved into a new phase.
Exactly. The Reign of Terror was over, but France was still searching for stability. Napoleon would soon take control and lead the country in a completely new direction.
After the Reign of Terror, France was exhausted. The country was still at war, and the revolution had left the government in chaos. The National Convention wrote a new constitution in 1795, creating a government called the Directory.
What was the Directory?
It was a group of 5 leaders who shared power. They also worked with 2 assemblies that made laws. The idea was to avoid giving too much power to one person.
That sounds smart, but did it work?
Not really. The Directory had big problems. It couldn't solve the country's financial troubles, and it was very unpopular. Plus, France was still at war with other countries, which only made things harder.
So, people weren't happy. That sounds like the perfect time for someone ambitious to take control.
You're exactly right. That's where Napoleon Bonaparte comes in.
Napoleon? Wasn't he a military leader?
Yes. He was a young general who became famous for winning battles in Italy. The people loved him because he was seen as a hero who could bring order back to France.
How did he take power?
In 1799, Napoleon staged a coup. He and his supporters took over the government, ending the Directory. Napoleon became the first consul, which made him the most powerful person in France.
So, was the revolution over?
Yes and no. The French Revolution, as it started in 1789, was over, but Napoleon used many ideas from the revolution, like equality and new laws, to build his own government. He created the Napoleonic Code, which is still important today.
That's amazing. So, the revolution didn't completely fail. It changed France forever, even if it didn't end the way people expected.
Exactly. The French Revolution got rid of feudalism and the monarchy, spread the idea of democracy, and inspired other revolutions around the world.
And Napoleon's rise showed how even a movement for freedom could lead to new forms of power.
Right. The story of the French Revolution is full of lessons about hope, change, and the risks of power. It reshaped France and left its mark on history forever.
And that's the story of the French Revolution, a time when the people of France stood up, fought for their rights, and changed history.
From the storming of the Bastille to the Reign of Terror and Napoleon's rise, it was a story of struggle, bravery, and big changes.
So, what do you think? Was the revolution worth it? Let us know in the comments.
And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Tell us whose story you'd like to hear next. History is full of incredible tales, and we can't wait to share them with you.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.